On Wednesday, the 40th death marking Mahsa Amini's death, we saw thousands of people gather in her hometown, thousands more gathered in several other cities. But yet we've heard reports that gunshots were fired, tear gas was used. So we're still seeing more people coming to the streets. There's more expected protests to be happening on Saturday. So we will be expecting a lot more people gathering to mourn her death, but to also call for justice and freedom for all in Iran.
Rothna, describe for us some of the scenes on the streets. How big are the gatherings and what response are the protesters getting from authorities?
On Wednesday, there were massive gatherings, and they were some of the largest that we've seen. Otherwise, the gatherings and the protests that we've been aware of are quite sporadic. They're in a lot of different places, across 13 different cities in Iran, throughout the country, not just in the borders, but all over the place. We've seen sporadic protests take place. They've also taken place in very defined ways. So we're seeing schoolgirls really in middle and high schools protesting and defying the dress code, but also calling for freedom and justice, particularly for those schoolgirls who've also been detained as a result of their actions. At university spaces as well, a lot of university students are also calling for justice and freedom, taking part in a number of different protests and defying actions as much as they can. And in the middle of all of that, we're seeing women simply defying the dress code itself by taking to the streets without the hijab and trying to live their life without as an act of protest, but simply just trying to see if they can normalize the idea of choice, that women can choose to simply walk out without the hijab as well.
So specifically, what are the demands of the protesters now?
We're seeing a whole range of demands. We've got women and girls talking about the end to all discriminatory laws, that they want freedom for themselves, but also justice. They want to call for the release for all those who have been detained as a result of the protests. But we're also seeing people calling for regime change. People are calling for the downfall of the authorities and want to see a wholesale change there as well. So we see all sorts of demands coming through from a wide spectrum of society. The death of Mahsa Amini has sparked a rage in the country from all sides because of a whole lot of repression that's been in this place for decades now, not just on women, but also society at large. We have authorities that will detain at will, that will sentence and try people for their civic activism, and they may even been sentenced to death. Right now, we've had reports that several hundreds of people have been killed during protests, but also several hundreds more who are currently in detention for for participating in protests or the authorities' perceived idea that they are somehow behind it. So we have journalists, human rights defenders, others who are, have been rounded up and arrested. And we're now starting to see trials taking place on charges that could lead to death sentences as well.
And as you say, the protests look set to continue, and they won't let up, these protesters, until their demands are met by the looks of it. Do you think this is a revolution unfolding?
It's incredible to see the kinds of actions that we're seeing that we haven't in the past. On an issue like women's rights, we haven't seen a society really gather and call for demands for women's dignity and their freedom. So this is a different change to what we've seen in the past. Now, Iran has a history of revolution. The country has indeed had a revolution and had a change in their authority as a result. And time and again, we see a civic uprising, but we also see a serious crackdown and quelling of any such uprising as well. But we are now in a stage where the authorities have been more repressive than ever before. The last decade, the last uprising, the most serious uprising that we saw was the 2009 Green Uprising, more than a decade ago now. And in that time, they've crushed a lot of the civil society actions. They've crushed a lot of that space that exists, and people are done with the repression that they have in society. In that time, people have managed to find different ways to keep calling for freedom, to keep calling for change. But they're fed up now, and the authorities must take serious action to show that they will actually concede to demands, that they will release protesters, that they will stop the trials of people who've been doing things for human rights activism, and ensure that they are repealing laws that discriminate against women and that quell freedom of expression.
But the response we've seen from the regime surely reflects its concern that it could be toppled.
The Iranian authorities are certainly worried. You can tell that the way in which the protests are happening, how sporadic they are, the quarters in which they're coming from has unnerved them. And we're also seeing support coming from even regime supporters. So people from the regime who don't think that compulsory hijab laws should exist. These are other, people who wear the hijab who are saying, well, it shouldn't really be enforced, and questioning why there is a morality police that's been doing this in the first place. So there's some of that discussion happening. But at the same time, because you have a wider set of protests taking place with much bigger demands, there's also just a general crackdown to end any level of civic disobedience and protesting. So the authorities are unnerved. They are unsure about some things, but at the same time, they do not want to see any concessions that could lead to bigger demands being made and being forced to come through on those changes either. Right now, we don't know where things are going to go, but there is no letter. We're seeing incredible actions from schoolgirls to much older people who are taking to the streets, who are finding ways to defy such incredible repression against them and are showing unbelievable bravery in doing so.
So what happens next for the protesters? How are they organising themselves? You say that a big protest is expected this weekend?
We're expecting a large protest happening this weekend, but we're also still seeing people finding different ways to defy the authorities. So as I said, in schools and in universities especially, this is the groundswell of activism happening. It doesn't seem to be organized from any specific quarter, and that's what's quite surprising by this uprising. We're really seeing people finding different ways to really call for action, to call for change, and it's not clear where things are going to go. Right now, the authorities' a heavy-handed approach is not actually quelling it entirely. That has worked in the past, where they've managed to entirely quell the uprising, but also to really push back on civic society. This is not ending right now. And now, if the authorities were wise to this, they would actually make the changes necessary to come through on people's demands for justice and freedom.
We'll be keeping a close eye. Rothna Begum, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.